What if light doesn't just expose what's wrong, but shows you the way forward? What if spiritual sight means learning to see differently, not just to see more? What's up, everybody? I'm Tyson Putthoff, and this is scene 18 of the JesusX30 challenge. We're following my 3-volume book trilogy called Jesus, the Strategic Life and Mission of the Messiah and His Movement. All 3 books are out now in print and ebook, so grab your copies wherever you buy your books. So in John 9, right after the Festival of Sukkot, Jesus leaves the temple and runs straight into a man who's been blind since birth. It's one of those encounters that seems kind of ordinary at first glance, but it ends up really redefining everything about what sight and sin and faith and faithfulness really mean. Okay, so the disciples see this man. Immediately they start making assumptions about him, and they're talking to Jesus too. Rabbi, they ask, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? John 9:2. Does that sound familiar with the way we approach those who are poor, those who are suffering, those who are dealing with difficult circumstances today? Yeah, we might help. We might offer a hand in certain circumstances, but we're always asking, I wonder what bad decision they made to put them in this particular position. Was it them? Was it their parents? I think these are, we tend to look at the disciples and we think, how could they ask this? And they're talking to Jesus. How could they actually say this horrible thought out loud? But then we go and do the same thing. I think right now is a good time for this particular reflection, because right now a lot of people are making assumptions about those who need help to feed their families. And the assumption from a lot of people is, well, somebody must have messed up along the way, rather than just saying, hey, how can I help? But this is a revealing question, right? The disciples are stuck in a world of blame. They're assuming every problem must have a cause. Every suffering must have a guilty party. In particular, the one who's suffering must have done something to bring upon himself or herself that suffering, right? And Jesus completely refuses to fall into this set of assumptions. And he breaks that framework apart right here, right now. He says neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be revealed in him. Okay? So that line shatters this assumption, this line of questioning, and it changes everything. And so Jesus is not saying that God caused the man's blindness. He's saying that even in this man's brokenness, the point is not to assign blame and then cast that person out as someone we're not going to help because they must have done something to deserve what they're going through. Jesus is not saying God caused that. He's also not saying that that assumption is okay. What he's saying instead is that God's creative power can break through no matter what's going on in someone's life. The man's condition isn't punishment. In this case, it's potential for God to show what God and only God can do. And then Jesus does something kind of strange, and it's a little awkward even. He spits on the ground and he makes some mud. He rubs it in his hands and he makes mud out of it. And then he puts it on the man's eyes. Okay? You remember this? And he says, go wash in the pool of Siloam in verse 7. So this is a healing, but it's symbolic in a lot of ways. So that pool had just been used in the water pouring ceremony of Sukkot. The same ritual Jesus had interrupted the day before when he shouted, if anyone is thirsty, let them come to me and drink. That pool was important because the priests would fill jugs of water for this water pouring ceremony during the Feast of Sukkot or the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths. And so that pool was already on everyone's mind. So Jesus performs the ritual, and then he says, go and wash in the pool of Siloam. And so the man goes, and he washes, and he comes back seeing. And this should have been a moment of joy, right? But instead, it actually triggers an investigation. The neighbors argue about whether this is really him, the blind man. The Pharisees drag him into questioning twice, and then his parents are summoned, And everyone wants an explanation that fits their own categories. But the miracle, the fact that Jesus just healed this person, that doesn't fit into the categories that any of these people want to see. And so they don't see it. They don't accept it. This is a classic case of confirmation bias, right? Confirmation bias is basically this human tendency to see only what we want to see. And so that's what everybody does. Even though they're staring at a guy that Jesus has just healed, they should be celebrating. And instead they're questioning and they're criticizing and they're critiquing and they're picking it apart because they don't want to see it. So they're not going to. And the more they pressure this man, the bolder he becomes. At first, all he says is this. He says, the man that they called Jesus healed me. But then later, when they accuse Jesus of being a sinner, the man gets a little bolder. And he actually answers them whether this guy's a sinner or not. He's saying, whether Jesus is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. John 9:25. So that line has really lived on even into today. I was blind, but now I see. Because it captures what faith looks like. It's not having all the answers. It's clarity that's born from an encounter with Jesus. You don't have to understand everything to be transformed by something. And eventually they throw this guy out of the synagogue. And that's when Jesus finds him again and he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the man asks, who is he, sir? And Jesus says, you have now seen him. In fact, he's the one speaking to you. So it's me. That's what Jesus tells him. And the man says, Lord, I believe. And he worships him. Verses 35 to 38. And so the story comes full circle. The one who couldn't see now recognizes the light of the world standing before him. But Jesus isn't done teaching. He's going to take it to the next level. So he turns to everybody around and he says, for judgment I have come into the world, so that the blind will see and those who claim to see will become blind. Verse 39. That's harsh, man. The greatest danger isn't physical blindness. It's spiritual certainty that leaves no room for growth. The opponents of Jesus thought that they saw everything clearly, but their pride, their biases, their hatred, their greed, their desire to be powerful and to maintain power kept them in the dark. And that's the caution, I think, for you and me too. When we think we've figured it out, when we think we've figured God out, when we think we've figured out his ways, we stop seeing what God is doing right in front of us. The people I know as a Bible scholar who are the most certain about their beliefs about a biblical idea or a theological idea or a biblical text and the meaning of it are usually the ones who know nothing about the Bible, who don't know what they're talking about, who probably don't read the Bible. And if they do, they read it through the lens of a TikTok video or a social media post or a political statement. The people I know who are the least certain about what they believe about the Bible or what they claim to know about the Bible are the people who genuinely do know what they're talking about. There's something about knowledge and open-mindedness that leads to humility. And it also leads to continued discovery. But there's something about deciding that this is how it is that leads to closing your eyes. And it's at that point where you don't see what God is doing. You begin to lose sight of who God really is. So this story isn't just about a miracle. It's about a mindset. It's about a framework, a worldview. Every person in it represents a way of seeing the world, right? The disciples see through blame. The neighbors see through skepticism. The Pharisees, they see through fear of losing control, losing their grip on power. But Jesus sees through compassion. And that's what restores sight. A lot of modern kind of scientific and psychological discoveries actually echo this truth. What we focus on shapes what we see. When we look for fault in someone else, we're going to find fault. If I look for the worst in you, I'm going to find the worst in you. If I go online and the algorithms start putting out videos of people I disagree with and showing them in their worst stage, in their most violent form, I'm going to find the most violent and the worst in everybody who's associated with that group. What we look for is what we're going to find. It's going to shape what we see. When we look for fault, we're going to find fault. When we look for evil, we're going to find evil in someone. When we look for blame, that they did this to themselves, that's how we're going to view them as a person. But when we start to look for possibility, we're going to start to notice grace. How your brain filters reality creates the story you believe. You actually, in a lot of ways, create the reality you live in, or you allow someone else to create the reality you live in. Cable news is a perfect example of this. Cable news seeks to create your reality so that you don't have to go out and experience it yourself. And they say, don't go near X, Y, Z types of person, because they want you to believe that there is a danger in going out there and experiencing that person firsthand. And so they create a reality that you start to believe. And then it's weird because usually when you go out and encounter that person that they've pitted you against, like this blind man, he was supposed to be the villain of the story in the disciples' eyes, the guy that either did something or his parents did something to get him in this horrible predicament. And then the disciples, they're with Jesus and they go and meet the guy, and he doesn't happen to fit the assumptions that they held about someone like him. And it starts to crumble the world that they've created, the reality that they've created. And that's Jesus's point. Jesus was teaching this long before neuroscience came along. He was teaching them to change their vision because it changes the way they view the world. And you notice that of all the people in the story, it's this blind man who comes back and says, yes, I believe. I see you, Jesus, for who you really are. And I think that might be what faith is really about. It's a practice of seeing differently, of learning to interpret your struggles not as punishments, but as places where God is working on. To believe that healing, spiritual, emotional, even relational, is still possible, even though you've had a huge blow up, or someone has conditioned you, cable news has conditioned you, or your politicians or society has conditioned you to see someone as the enemy. Maybe when you and I start to encounter them directly rather than through that third party filter, that's when we genuinely and truly begin to see who God is. When you and I start to see that way, we stop needing to assign blame and look at someone as bad, as the enemy. And we start instead looking for connections and for potential and for transformation. What if this week, instead of asking, who's to blame? Who caused this? You and I ask, how can God reveal something here? What if you and I stop rehearsing these mantras that we've been taught about how to view our world and how to create the reality that we live in, and instead we start to see it through this episode in John 9, and we stop looking at people for their failures and assigning identities and assigning categories to them that are negative, and instead we start looking for the positive. Sounds too simple, but trust me, it works. And what about with the way you view yourself? What about the way we talk about ourselves and the lens through which we see ourselves? What if you and I stop rehearsing failure and start reframing failures as chances at formation, chances at growth? It's not denial. That's discipleship. Discipleship is literally following Jesus around, allowing him to point out where we fail and use those as moments to grow us, just like he's doing with the disciples here. And sometimes more harshly, like a coach, and sometimes more gently, like a teacher, right? But at the end of the day, the point is to view even failures in a positive light, so that Jesus can start to build us up instead of crush us down. It's what happens when you let the light of the world retrain your eyes, because that's what Jesus is still doing. He's helping us see again in a new and in a fresh way, not just with vision, but with a new and completely fresh perspective. Lekulmad, go and learn. Come back for scene 19 of the JesusX30 challenge.